Hey, St. Catharines, Mayor Matt Cisco here, episode 4 of talkSTC. Coming back to you, a really great episode in front of us today. This one is special for me. This one, we're going to talk about some things that are very near and dear to my heart. We're chatting with representatives from two organizations that have given a lot to my family, that my family has tried to be a part of. We're going to start off today with Michelle Lewis, who's the Executive Director of the Young Caregivers Association, and we're going to follow that up with Mike Cnudde, the Communications Specialist from Autism Ontario. So, very important episode for me, and I hope you find these interviews interesting, enlightening, and they add something to your understanding of what exactly goes on in our community in St. Catharines. So, up first, we have Michelle Lewis. Michelle, thank you so much for being here today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Michelle Lewis is the Executive Director of the Young Caregivers Association, a not-for-profit agency with a mission to serve caregiving children, youth, young adults, and their families in Canada. She's been with the organization since 2012 and is focused on thinking strategically around barriers young caregivers experience and how to build the capacity of professionals working with families. Understanding the young caregiver experience herself, she uses her lived experience and passion to find ways to support as many young caregivers as possible. Michelle, that is an incredible background. Can you tell me a little bit, what is the Young Caregivers Association?
Sure. So we're 20 years old, so we're not new. Our work started with the Alzheimer's Society of Niagara in the early 2000s, where in working in people's homes, they discovered that there were children and youth in the home with persons with dementia, and those kids were stressed and they were showing signs of depression and anxiety. They were able to identify at least 75 of those kids right off the bat and said, okay, we need to do something about this. So they created our organization. They realized that it was family caregiving that was happening, but there was an impact on those kids, and there wasn't a service or support or resource specific for them, so they created it.
How many kids do you see in a caregiving role? And I'll give a little bit of background for the community to know. My kids have been involved with young caregivers for a number of years. In our family, my youngest son has autism, and we knew from an early age that they needed support to be able to, learn how to be caregivers in that sort of role. And caregivers can mean a bunch of different things as well. It's not just, siblings. It could be parents. It could be grandparents. How many kids in Niagara are in that sort of a caregiving role, and what sort of span does caregiving include?
So you're absolutely right. There's no two situations that are quite similar when it comes to caregiving. We have children and youth who are doing physical care. So we have kids who know how to do feeding tubes with siblings. They're dealing with parents with young onset dementia. They know how to give medications, how to monitor symptoms and medication. So there's that physical hands-on caregiving that's happening. Then there's also the helping the household be successful. So we have kids where the caregiving is making the meals, keeping the family going, helping the household be successful by taking on those extra responsibilities. And then there's the impact. So if somebody's dying in the home, if there's a terminal diagnosis, if there's a change in diagnosis, there's grief that goes with that. So there's just the impact. And a lot of these kids play that cheerleader role in their house. So they're the ones that try to keep everybody upbeat. They're the ones who are calming people, reassuring people. So there's also the emotional impact of the role. As far as how many we have in Niagara, that's a challenge. We have very little data in Canada about how many young caregivers we're talking about. The only number we have is from the General Social Survey back in 2012, and it's suggesting that we have over 1 million kids across Canada, but that's only ages 15 plus.
Yeah.
So when we take those numbers and apply them to Niagara, we're talking about at least 20,000, again, only ages 15 plus. The majority of kids we support are under the age of 15. So we're talking about thousands of children and youth in Niagara.
Well, and one of the things that I've discovered when I talk to other adults, there are so many adults in society that don't realize that there are kids, 15 and up, but 14 and down as well, that are in these situations that are taking on roles that we wouldn't associate with roles children should be taking on. But getting to understand more about the organization, and full disclosure, my wife does work for Young Caregivers, and it really came down to, it was an organization that had been so helpful to our family. She saw the good work that you were doing, and an opportunity arose. But hearing the stories and understanding, so many adults don't realize what the need is. And so to have an organization like yours is really fantastic. Now, next month you're going to be launching virtual programs for young caregivers. So I'm wondering if you can give us a little bit of information of that. It's happening across Canada, correct?
Correct. So one of the things that came out of COVID was virtual programs. So we've been running virtual programs since the start of COVID, when in-person things weren't an option. And the need has been expressed across Canada because we're the only funded program in Canada doing what we're doing. St. Catharines is home to the very first young caregiver program in North America. So we're at a place now where we're being turned to as the leaders, as the thought leaders, and as the sort of community practice leaders across Canada, and there's an appetite for this to start supporting these kids in other provinces. So the virtual programs are a part of that. So just a couple weeks ago, we had a webinar hosted by Andre Picard where we brought in an expert panel and we launched a knowledge center. So again, in response to the need and in response to what we're hearing from professionals and hearing from young caregivers, we put together this resource online that people can go to get tips, to get ideas of how you can start engaging with young caregivers, what to look for, how to identify them. The problem is, unless you're in St. Catharines or in Niagara region, we also have expanded to Hamilton, Halton, and Norfolk. So unless you're local, you don't have access to supports. Mm-hmm. So we're expanding our virtual programs nationwide so that any kid anywhere can access them.
And then I think that's a really important piece. I know, and again, I'll turn to my own personal family experience, but my kids accessed the programming during COVID, and it was a touch point that they needed. Mm-hmm. And the staff that you have running programming for kids, it's so important in their lives. It becomes a very regular feature of their day-to-day life, and it's amazing. I mean, you have a great relationship with the school boards, the DSBN and Niagara Catholic, with Powerhouse in Schools, the Powerhouse in Schools program. My kids have taken part in Powerhouse now. I think my oldest probably started like 6 or 7 years ago. So it's been a long-running program. Can you tell me a little bit about it and how it helps youth?
Looking at access and health equity, unless you are able to get to the physical locations where we run in-person programs, not everybody can access those. When you look about the rural communities across Niagara, a kid gets off a school bus and they're at home until they get on the school bus the next day. There's barriers to transportation, to accessing the programs. Also looking at communities across Niagara where we aren't running in-person programs, what are those areas that we can tap into to start identifying young caregivers and working with those professionals. So going to schools made sense. You go to where their bums are already in the seats, you work with the professionals that are already a part of their community, it's a safe place for them, it's familiar to them. So working with the DSBN and the Catholic Board to identify young caregivers to come in and facilitate our programs in the schools in a safe and already familiar environment is a way for us to access far more children. We got specific expansion funding for that from Ontario Health, and we have accessed over 100 additional young caregivers a year that we wouldn't have accessed normally.
And what's been the response with the kids in the schools?
Really more than what we expected. We expected for there to be, some decreased stress and improved well-being just from the nature of the curriculum. But really what we hear is that social connection, that kids in their school that they wouldn't have socialized with typically because they're just in different groups or different grades, they found this common experience that brought them together, and they made new friends, and they had somebody who understood their situation. So it really helped reduce that isolation for them.
That's amazing. And I'd love to hear that because, listen, even as adults, we always need somebody to lean on. We need somebody who maybe understands the experience we're going through. To hear that that's being brought into schools for kids in those situations, I'm very blessed and privileged that I didn't encounter that as a kid, so I didn't have that additional stress. But if I had, having someone else who knew what it felt like, I think would have been a pretty major part of my life. You have a great relationship with Brock University as well when it comes to research and the evaluation of what you're doing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the Child and Youth Studies Department specifically, Dr. Heather Chalmers, who's a professor there, did the very first study in Canada on young carers, and that was back in 2005. So when we started our organization and started bringing awareness to the community, she was brought on board as a partner and was all in and conducted a much needed study. The data from that study in 2007 allowed us to get healthcare funding. So it was a very integral part of why we exist and why we're funded. And that connection continues to exist. Dr. Chalmers is the key researcher on our Knowledge Hub, on our Knowledge Center that was just launched. She's got PhD students who are continuing with the research. Brock's probably the leading university, I would say, in Canada right now focusing on young caregivers.
That's phenomenal to have that in the community as a
Absolutely.
touch point. So May is Caregiver Awareness Month. What's on the horizon for young caregivers? What do you have planned?
So we have partners across Canada. There's Caregivers British Columbia, Caregivers Alberta, Caregivers in Nova Scotia. We work collaboratively on Caregiver Aware, so it's a month-long campaign. We bring the expertise about the young caregiver piece. So we're tapped into as that resource, so we're contributing to that campaign. We have Echo, our mascot, which was designed by the kids. Echo's very special because Echo's a sea turtle that represents caregiving, because you carry your home on your back, you ride the waves of life, but you're calm and collected. And you have a tough shell, but you're soft and you have lots of feelings on the inside. And that all came from the young caregivers. So we're really trying to get Echo into the hands of young caregivers. So we're looking for partnerships and sponsorships to bring Echo to life and to have Echo be more of a part of when we're working with the young caregivers, because it represents them.
That's amazing. I've seen Echo. Echo is awesome, but I'm looking forward to seeing more of Echo. Listen, if you're in the community and you're talking to folks in the community, what do you want them to know about young caregivers, what they go through, what sort of supports they need? What's the important message that needs to get out there?
All of us likely know a young caregiver. If we know somebody who has an illness or disability and there's kids in that home, those kids are affected. And they're not going to self-identify. There's an element of secrecy that goes with it. My mom said, "Don't tell anybody," in our situation, and we didn't, because she was fearful that it would be looked at in a negative way. So it's up to the adults, and that's where we're shifting our focus to building the awareness in professionals. If you're working with children, youth, families, if there's illness or disability, talk to those kids. How is it impacting them? How is it affecting them? If it's your neighbors, ask, what the kids need. How are they feeling? So it's really just about being aware that these kids are there and they're doing a heck of a lot to support their families.
And I think that last piece is important. I think sometimes there's a bit of a stigma that's attached with it, and people want to cast aspersions. And this is, I think, something as a society we're trying to get away from, is, trying to make assumptions about the situations that people are in. Okay, so we'll call this the last question.
Okay.
10 years from now, where's Young Caregivers? And this seems to be one of my favorites. I love to know, what are the big plans, what are the long-range plans? Where's Young Caregivers in 10 years? What sort of situations have you gotten yourselves into to help young people who are in these situations and roles?
We're lucky that there's groups in Canada that are focused on family caregivers. So Petro Canada has a foundation called the Caremakers Foundation, which is brand new, dedicated to caregivers. We've been the recipient of a couple of big grants for them to help us get this going. So in 10 years, we're going to be piloting powerhouse programs in other provinces this coming year. So in 10 years, that's no longer a pilot. There's Powerhouse Alberta, BC, there's Powerhouse in all the provinces. Young caregiver isn't an unfamiliar term anymore. We've got professionals who are doing family-focused support. The notion of young caregiving won't be unfamiliar anymore in 10 years, and there will be supports for these kids.
I love that. Well, hopefully our conversation today gets it out into our community here in St. Catharines and Niagara a little bit more. Michelle, thank you so much for sharing about what the young caregivers are. Sincerely appreciate it, and I wish you good luck when we get to May and Young Caregivers Awareness Month.
Thank you so much.
After the break, we're going to be talking to my friend Mike from Autism Ontario. I hope you stick with us. Welcome back, St. Catharines. I have to make an apology here. So when we started the episode, I completely botched the pronunciation of my next guest's name, Mike Cnudde. Cnudde, correct?
Correct.
There we go. I knew I was going to get it eventually. Mike Cnudde from Autism Ontario. He's a communication specialist. Joined the organization just prior to the pandemic. Mike, welcome, and thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I really do appreciate you having me on board.
So before we get into talking about Autism Ontario, I want to hear a little bit about you. I know you're on the autism spectrum. We had that conversation before. Can you give us a little bit of information? What was your life like? How you came to this role as a communication specialist?
Sure. I mean, I've worked in corporate communications for over 30 plus years. Mostly it's been the financial services kind of end of things. And I was diagnosed with autism fairly late in life. at 55. I'm 60 now. So, and I was told, by my family doctor at the time, I could either go one of two ways. Either you could get your diagnosis and pay for it, which would cost anywhere between $3,000 and $5,000, or I could go through the public sector. In this case, it was the Center for Mental Health and Addiction, CAMH in Toronto. And that would be free, but you may not get it. And so I said, well, I can't afford the money. Let's try that. And so thanks to my doctor, very persistent, on the second try, she got me in there. And it took a very quick diagnosis to find out that I was what you would call high support, no, probably low support, pardon me, on the autism spectrum. And even in the time that I've been with the organization, how we talk about autism, how we approach autism has shifted tremendously. Some people still call themselves Asperger's, and I was told that I could refer to myself with that and get away with it. So basically, or high functioning, but we tend to go away from the functioning labels now, and we talk about the levels of support we need. So I'm probably what you'd call low support. But in terms of what it's meant to me, it's more of an explanation, but not an excuse. It said, okay, this is how my life has gone. This is why it explains a few things to me. And this is how I can move forward with it. And it was only through I would call a short order miracle that I found myself working with Autism Ontario. And I think I mentioned to you off air before we joined, it's very much a job where I feel like I'm working on the side of the angels, because we're reaching out and helping a lot of people.
Well, you are, and the side of the angels is definitely correct. And I will say this, language is important, right? And just now in this conversation, talking about low support versus high support. So some in the community know this, but my youngest son has autism, and I think he would fall on the high support end of the spectrum. But I love that because it deals with, the important aspect of what people require to continue to live a full life.
Exactly. It's no longer the functioning end. That's why it's getting away now. The scriptures are more talking about levels of support a person needs to succeed.
And that's exactly it. And I love that. But that was why this was important to me today, because I know the good work that you folks do at Autism Ontario. I think it's phenomenal. So with that in mind, tell me a little bit about the organization. Tell me about the programs and the services you've got, and what's available in Niagara.
Well, sure. Autism Ontario, first of all, it's a nonprofit organization. We've been around for 50 plus years now. They're celebrating our 50th year this year. We are providing, first of all, and often after a first diagnosis, either in the family or personally, a person will reach out to us for that first important contact for information, for referral. Often it's through our care coordination. And we have a network of care coordinators across through the regions, across the province, who can direct people and guide people and families to programs for them. And so we run programs. We would events like webinars. We have their social learning programs right across the province. And during the pandemic, we really had to kind of change gears and do a lot of it virtually. But now we're kind of coming back, taking with us the best. For example, the webinars that we had, we learned from.
So providing those support services for the families and the folks who need them.
Exactly.
No, that's phenomenal. And so, educate the public. This is an opportunity. What are the sort of challenges that folks on the autism spectrum and their families face?
Well, they face many challenges. I can give you a couple. For example, cost is a huge thing. If we're talking about, say, for example, according to the 2018 Baby Report, we talk between, for paying for 1 year of services, ABA, Applied Behavioral Analysis, for example, it could cost anywhere between $5,000 and $50,000 per child per year. And that's well beyond what many families can carry, and most families, I would say. That's only 1 year per child. Certainly doesn't. Most courses does not stop just for 1 year, and many families have more than one child on the spectrum, and so it's a lot of money. And a lot of families just find that struggle with that. Mm-hmm. And I've seen how do they carry on? We might ask. Well, they sell things. If they have a house, they put a house in a second, third mortgage. They have a vacation property. They sell that. Sell cars. Get a part-time job.
Yeah.
Others, though, I've also seen families come together. I met families who will step it up out of love, and they will raise funds. They'll do stuff on social media to bring awareness and bring support, and they'll become active in the autism community because of that. And that fills me with hope.
Yeah.
Your worship, that does.
Yeah, no, and I've had the opportunity to see it firsthand, and I've known people in exactly the situation you just described, where the costs of therapies are so extreme that they're building out basement apartments to run as Airbnbs,
Sure.
to do whatever they can to raise funds.
Sure.
They're selling off property and possessions, and I mean those are the lengths that people go to for their loved ones, right?
They'll do it because they love them, and they know they're the first best. They're the first and best.
Yeah.
I mean, there are other forms. There are treatments out there like ABA and other forms of evidence-based therapies and treatments that are offered, certainly.
Yeah.
But this is what I and you've seen, this acting out of love,
Yeah. No, and we're lucky in Niagara. We have a number of organizations that have come together to work with people with autism to try and build out new therapies.
Right.
So with all of that said, one of the biggest things we've talked about in Ontario is the wait lists.
Of course.
Where does Autism Ontario stand when it comes to the issues around?
Well, first of all, we continue to advocate for the reduction of the wait lists.
Yeah.
Because we know these are a challenge for many, many families, especially when they're trying to get their early diagnosis and the intervention. We also advocate for the earliest intervention for children on the spectrum.
Yeah.
But we know that the wait lists are causing there are heavy weight on the families, and we continue to advocate for their reduction. It's something we've consistently done.
Yeah, it's one of the things that first got me involved in autism advocacy was with my son, and seeing those wait lists and how long they were, and a lot of kids aged out of the system, never being able to access the treatment when they needed it when they were younger.
And that's the thing too. I mean, you find a lot. I mean, when children on the spectrum, they get older and hit 18, they age out, and suddenly what's there for them isn't there for them anymore. And there's a whole other set of worries and concerns that adults on the spectrum face.
Yeah.
And frankly, that's a very underserved community.
It definitely is, and you're not wrong there at all. So with respect to autism, what's the prevalence like in Canada? Like, how many people do we expect would receive an autism diagnosis?
Well, actually, there are new figures out based on 2019, and it's now 1 in 50.
1 in 50.
Well, so that comes to 1 and 2% of the population. And so Ontario, and these are all low-end estimates, so they could be, actually figure it could be higher. But we're talking maybe 133,000 in Ontario alone. But as I say again, those are like kind of the low-end estimates.
Yeah, and this is a conversation that I've had with people over the last couple of years saying, it seems like the numbers are increasing.
Right.
But I think part of that comes down to getting better at diagnosing it and understanding
That's
the
exactly
disorder
right.
a little bit better.
I mean, I was having this conversation with one of your aides in the green room prior to this, and it's exactly that. I mean, back in the day when I was first born, autism was long thought of as being an emotional issue.
Yeah.
And the mom was called the refrigerator mom because it was like your mom didn't love you enough. And and I said this, I don't know how many women have been hurt by that.
Yeah.
But it was formative, and so but our knowledge and understanding has grown over the years, especially in the last 20, 30 years. And with each revision of DSMV, which is the diagnostic manual, each edition, each iteration, we've begun to understand more about autism, the class, and our understanding has grown. And therefore, as our understanding grows, more people are diagnosed. I mean, our diagnosis gets better and our understanding gets better. That's why I think the numbers are growing like they are. It's not because there's any kind of plague or explosion in numbers. It's basically because as you say, we're getting much better understanding these things.
And that's exactly it. So there's a national autism strategy. Can you give me a little bit about that?
This is something that the federal government it's an initiative that the federal government is behind. And right now I understand it's probably in the committee level. But anyhow, Autism Ontario has been supporting this, along with all the other provincial, territorial associations. We work well working with the national organizations as well, and we believe this is something that will help. The goal of the National Autism Strategy, when in place, is to make sure no matter where you go in the country, you have the access to the same level of supports and services wherever you are. And this will also mean, we hope, expanded services for adults on the spectrum as well.
Okay. That's phenomenal. It's great to hear that the federal government's involved with that.
Yeah.
Now, very quickly, last question I got for you today.
And I would add that if your viewers should probably reach out to their MPs to let them know how important this is to them.
Oh, you stole my ending to all of this to reach out. But last question. April 2nd is World Autism Awareness Day.
Exactly.
Tell me very quickly, why do we celebrate it?
We celebrate that because we celebrate the diverse population, numbers of people on the spectrum, and their accomplishments.
Yeah.
Their families, their supporters, they're our allies. We celebrate all that. The community comes together. It says, we're here. This is what we've done, and something, we're proud of it.
That's phenomenal. Mike, thank you so much. Thank you for doing the good work that you do at Autism Ontario and for sharing your story with the community today. I appreciate it, and I appreciate you coming in.
Well, Mayor Cisco, my pleasure.
Excellent. Thank you to Mike and Autism Ontario. Stick with us. We'll be right back after the break. St. Catharines, thank you again for joining me on this episode. I want to say a big thank you to Michelle from the Young Caregivers Association and Mike from Autism Ontario. Two really important organizations, and I'm not going to lie, two organizations that are incredibly important to me and my family. I hope you got something from the episode, have a little bit of a better understanding of what some of the folks in our community go through on a regular basis. I hope you will join us again here for talkSTC next time. Thank you again. Have a great evening.